One thing I had was, this, while we're on the subject of elections,
Yeah.
is, obviously people think, oh, I'm frustrated with no health care, or I'm frustrated with this or that. So therefore I'm gonna go vote for this candidate because they support that. Or maybe they go the next stage and they say, well, I'm going to get involved with a political party and volunteer and work in a campaign, and because this candidate supports what I want. So that's like believing that elections are going to actually have an effect. So you think because I'm electing my candidate, they're going to vote for my policy in Congress, and somehow this policy will become the law of the land, right? But it hasn't worked that way for the last at least 40 years. So one of the things that I came across in that article I shared with you, and I'll share the screen here. This is an Australian socialist online journal that I came across. And this article was pretty good because it's, and I don't know much about this Eleanor Morley who wrote the article. She's written a couple of things about the.
Oh, she works with Lee Camp.
Yeah. She works with what?
Lee Camp.
Oh, Lee Camp. Okay.
Okay.
I didn't know that. So anyways, she's written some things on the Minsk protests in Belarus. But this piece was kind of interesting. And her contention is that the change comes about through struggle, not elections. So, for instance, she gives the example of the, she doesn't give the example, but I give the example of the populist movement in the 1890s, which even though they didn't win, they won some local elections and they won some governorships. They never won the White House, but they still were successful in pushing the Democratic Party to enact, or just in general, pushing through some of these policies like the income tax, getting off the gold standard ultimately, and women's suffrage. So they had an effect. And also she contends, for instance, in the 30s that Roosevelt was elected in 32 and reelected in 36. But it was the fact that there were these strikes going around the country in 1934 where workers were really successful in closing down whole cities, like in Minneapolis and Toledo and San Francisco. And this really scared the ruling elites, and that pushed FDR to implement a lot of his policies, which they call the second New Deal, which was more radical than the first New Deal, like Social Security and these policies.
So I agree with that. I agree that the idea that movements push actual change more than elections. I mean, it's become kind of ridiculous to the point that we know that whatever the platform the party adopts is basically meaningless. That, it's very little chance that they're going to actually do anything from that. So the modern equivalent would be like, is the protests going on across the country going to actually result in any legislation or any meaningful change? I mean, that's the modern equivalent.
Well,
right?
She says there's two things. Number one, it can result in change if there's enough people and it scares the elites. For instance, in the 1890s or the first years of the 20th century, I'm not sure which, but you had this group called Coxey's Army, Coxey, that marched on Washington. This was like disgruntled farmers from around the country who just showed up, to push this populist platform. And if you had an equivalent type of thing today, with 1 million out of work, hungry people, let's say, 6 months from now, marching on Washington, that could have an influence on politicians, number one. And number two, if nothing else, it changes the consciousness of the participants. So the participants become politically engaged. They're more likely to vote. They're more likely to volunteer with a campaign or a party than they would be otherwise. So these movements have a dual purpose. One is, increasing consciousness of the participants as well as trying to influence policy changes, right?
So the modern equivalents, right? So when Trump got elected, there was all sorts of protests, for pro science and so forth. Did that actually affect any change? And are the current protests likely to affect any change? I think just because politicians being who they are, they will pander to people that, the squeaky wheel, if something's going on like that. And they certainly, fear that for the loss of their job if they don't make the appearance of trying to do something. But they just seem to be able to get away right now with saying, orange man bad, and COVID, and
that's the point.
COVID's killing us, and it's all Trump's fault.
So Eleanor Morley in this article is saying basically that
Yeah.
the elections are a distraction. I mean, I wouldn't go that far. I think elections are important, but she would say that she calls it electoralism. I would call it electionalism, I think is a more accurate term. But the idea is that people get fixated on, Biden versus Orange Man. And it's like the whole Black Lives Matter, which was huge a few months ago, now has been eclipsed by the drama of, the game show of the election, and that's distracted people from the actual trying to implement some of the policies of like police reform and all this stuff that we talked about a few months ago.
Well, and the funny thing is, what's meaningfully come out of this Black Lives Matter protest is both candidates talking up about support for the police, and they're arguing over who is more into funding the police, so.
Or fracking or something, right?
Or fracking or something. So, I guess we're just broken. I don't know.
Well, so it ultimately comes down to, as far as, one thing, these protests, they increase consciousness. If you participate in a campaign or a protest, you're going to become more engaged, right? But as far as what influence do you really have over the politicians, over the elite? Ultimately comes, from a Marxist perspective, you can withhold your labor. So if you go on strike and don't work, at least in the industrial world of 100 years ago, that was a real threat to, or even like under Roosevelt, that was in the 30s, that was a threat of, if you didn't work, the country wasn't able to produce its basic gross domestic product or whatever it is. They wouldn't be able to do that.
Sure.
And the other side of that is soldiers refused to fight, which is what happened in the World War I with the Russian, after the Tsar fell in February of 1917. This was before the October Revolution. There was actually a non-communist revolution for like 6 months before that under Kerensky, and the soldiers refused to fight. So that also led to the collapse of that regime. And then in Vietnam, the parallel, which is described in this particular article, the soldiers there, they were aware of what was going on with the anti-war movement at home, and they were getting high all the time, and they were totally disillusioned and not buying into the whole domino theory, and we have to defeat the communists. And they knew that the South Vietnamese government was totally corrupt. It was just a puppet regime, and so they lost their interest in doing that. And so that's another lever that can be brought on the ruling power. So if you stop fighting for them and you stop producing for them as workers, then that's a threat. Now, I would argue that that's changing ultimately with increasing automation, not only in production, but in AI and warfare. That's the ultimate goal of the elites, is not have to depend on people at all, because machines don't go on strike. But
that's true.
But ultimately, when it comes down to it, that's a lot scarier to the elites than an election, because the elections, they pretty much have it under control. I mean, they have a system with Republicans and Republicans light under the Democrats, basically, that it's twiddle-dum and twiddle-dee. No matter which party is in control, they're not really going to be threatened. They will be threatened by
things pretty well. Yeah, they have things pretty well locked down since Ross Perot. They locked down the kicked the woman voter, was it legal women voters from organizing the debate. So now they basically have total control of the whole process.
Right.
And now, the fact that people are such saps and will put up with the Democrats just rigging like every primary, apparently, here we'll just, I think they would get more respect. They would actually have less ill will if they actually simply said, from now on, we're just going to select the candidate, rather than have this fake primary that then they have to rig. It's just like, why don't they just say, we know best, and we're going to work in your interest, and we're going to pick a candidate? Then you wouldn't have all these people that are just like so disgusted with them because they just obviously rigged the primary, Sorry, off on a tangent.
No, they try to maintain the facade, right? The facade of democracy.
Yeah, and they're trying to figure out how to do that. I think they're trying to figure out how to actually control the primary without it being quite so obvious next time, you know.
But I mean, what levers can people pull to actually change the system besides elections? It seems like, you know, you pull the lever when you vote, I guess, so to speak. But like, you know, can we, you know, are we beyond the time when people can go and strike, you know, have a mass strike, a mass work stoppage, or you know, we have a volunteer army, so they're not really going to refuse to, you know, when you had draft,
Right.
it was different, right? But like,
That's right.
you know, so how do you really put pressure on the elite to push for change? I don't know. I don't know if you guys have any ideas how you would do that. I mean, do we just keep working on elections? Is that the way to go?
Yeah, I mean,
putting the question out there.
The only hope I have right now, I'm clinging to, is that, you know, Massachusetts, we have the ranked choice voting vote. I'm just kind of hoping that if that, I mean, but that's, you're talking such a slow process before that would move across the country, and then people would have to demand that also is in place for national elections before it really is going to make a big difference, and we can get third parties involved, and we're doomed before that would actually come across anyway. So I don't have any answers.
I mean, do we just educate people, Daisy? Do you think that? I mean, do we just educate people? Is that what?
I don't have any answers either. The problem is that we're so beaten down, and you know, we were kind of talking about this in our pre-show chat the other day, how, you know, we're getting to the point where we as a species essentially, well, you know, there are obviously human beings that live in like the Amazon, and you know, they're able to, you know, take care of themselves, but for the most part are we are we're serfs, you know, like we have to kneel to the government because we need to suck off that teat. We cannot live on our own. You know, like we were talking about the other day, you know, if something were to happen, if some sort of emergency were to happen, the majority of people, what do? They're going to look to their government to make sure that the government has some sort of plan in place, right? And the expectation is that, like, also like what we were talking about, that if you're paying taxes to live here, you pay these taxes with some sort of expectation, right? Most people think that you know, it's their taxes that are paying for things, when in actuality that's not how money works. Money is created and then they just tax it, like all the money that they create, then they just tax us on that money, you know, so that way kind of there is no like inflation and all this kind of stuff. And but you know, the price that you pay for living here is that you, like I said, you have this expectation of what government will do. And we've gotten to the point where we've become so complacent, especially here in the Western world, when there's so many other parts of the world, especially where that they are having to pay the price for our luxury, for our complacency, for our convenience. I think about, you know, these kids in like the Congo. I think I just saw something where there's I think it's like 40,000 kids are being used to mine for cobalt and, you know, and all of these different minerals and shit that goes into our electronics, you know. And we sit here, and the majority of us unfortunately sit here and complain about, you know, our government not doing shit. But you know, this is what our government is doing. That's the problem, is that because we're not educating ourselves on what our government is actually doing. First of all, you can't hold them to account if you don't know what they're doing, right? And because of the fact that we don't hold them to account, and because we are so uneducated, the majority of us are so uneducated, they feel like, well, I mean, if they're not going to ask anything of us, then we're not going to do anything for them. You know, that's just what it comes down to. So that's why these elections, or even a lot of these movements, they feel kind of futile. If you really think about the fact that, think about this year, how many they're still now in Philadelphia, they're having to call in the National Guard because of all the riots and like looting and all this kind of stuff that's going on because of another death that was at the hands of a police officer. And no matter what the story is, the fact that all year we've been having to deal with all of these things, and the Democrats' answer to that is to give you Biden, the author of the 1994 crime bill, and
Right.
Kamala. Okay, like that is
Yeah.
they're
Right.
not listening. They're not listening.
Yeah.
And so what
and
are we
Biden's
supposed to do?
And Biden's response to Rodney King was to write a policeman's bill of rights or something like that. It's like,
But then if you think about it,
it's pretty horrific. Yeah.
what Biden, how many times has he told people, then go vote for Trump? Or, like,
Oh, yeah.
he's so flippant about it. He doesn't care. Just like all of them, they don't care because they think, just like Thomas Frank, even though like I watched the interview that he did with Massachusetts Peace Organization, which I thought was really great. But even the fact that he was saying that the whole thing is that we just have to get Trump out. It doesn't matter. Trump is the bad guy.
Yeah.
It's just all about getting Trump out. Even though Biden is, it's almost, you can say that it can almost be worse because of what we've been talking about, that people just want things to go back to normal. They want to be able to go back to sleep. They want to be able to go to brunch.
I was going to say, that's the right word. They want to go back to sleep. You don't want to worry about, okay, those cages will still be there in the border, but we won't worry.
Who built the cages?
But
exactly like what Trump said. Who built the cages?
Yeah, we won't worry about them anymore, right? Yeah, we won't worry about them anymore. They can do more attacks on Native Americans. What am I talking about there?
Standing Rock.
Yeah, Standing Rocks and all that. And people will, again, it'll be under the wire. They just won't care. Any kind of peace movement can stay asleep. Despite what Biden's likely to do.
And even you have like Extinction Rebellion, and you have the Sunshine Movement, all of these environmental movements that are all behind Biden, and oh my God, and all this. Right. When he has come out and said that he is not for fracking, right? Again, it's like they spit in your face constantly. What you are begging from them, they just like they couldn't care less about what it is that you want. This is anti-populism. I feel like that's what this is.
I mean, the Democrats really get their act together when they're trying to put down, the left or progressives or whatever, or populists, whatever you want to call it.
Oh yeah.
They're not very effective at fighting against Republicans. They want to get along. In fact, they're putting, Biden's going to put a bunch of Republicans in his cabinet.
Oh sure.
But like, when it comes to like trying to quash any kind of upsurge among the Democrats, like, our revolution or whatever, then they just, they'll do whatever it takes to, like, voter fraud or whatever. Like, you look at what was the state where they had, like, Iowa, where they had that fiasco with the software and everything.
Oh yeah, with the app.
I mean, they'll just or they'll co-opt, Bernie Sanders is like, an old guy who had a heart condition, and they're just gonna, like, they'll buy him out. And
look at the convention. They had like a couple of Republicans speak, but they couldn't have Tulsi speak, who won several. I mean, it's just like in your face.
I mean, even AOC, they gave her like a minute, and she
was under. It had to be videotaped.
Far from super progressive.
It had to be videotaped and pre-review and review beforehand, right?
But then again, you have somebody like Tulsi. If you really look at what they did to her during this primary, you have someone who she is the ultimate candidate of America, right? Like, that's who you think about, a vet, someone who I mean, she's nice to look at, you know what I'm saying? Like, she's not like these old ass people. She's a really down to earth person. The way that she talks to people, she doesn't talk down to people. She really interacts, and I feel she was a good representative for her state. But look at how they treated her, and look at how, more so than how they treated her, look at how the public, there was very few people that actually stood up for her. Okay, like this whole, anti-bullying type of, environment that we have, and all this all went to anti-feminism, or the whole feminist thing that it's. Just because she's a woman, like no one came to her defense.
And it's really,
like, no one cared.
And it's really, it comes down to really basic, like high school peer pressure kind of stuff. Like, I'm going to be a good team player. The team is against Tulsi because why? I don't know why, you know.
Which
Yeah,
again goes back to democracy. Remember the mob
yeah,
rule thing.
yeah, and it is they weaponize that mob rule and that you know, that peer pressure and that high school girl bullshit really effectively.
I mean, I was so blown away when I watched Glenn Greenwald on Joe Rogan, right? He did like 3 hours. It was a really good interview, but they actually talked about how Barry Weiss had gone. They were talking about like the consensus of type of information or whatever, and how these people, it's not it. What he actually pretty much carried water for Barry Weiss. Barry Weiss. He said that it was just like she got nervous. It's not that she didn't actually feel these things for Tulsi, or that this is what she was fed as the acceptable information, or this is what we think of Tulsi. You know, that she's an Assad toady. You know, like you don't even need to know what that means, but she's that. But he actually said that it's just that she got nervous and she couldn't like explain herself properly, or
Glenn
something.
Greenwald.
Yes, Glenn.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
And I was like, are you fucking kidding me,
Right.
Glenn? Like, seriously, you just fucking left The Intercept because of all of the shenanigans that go on with the censorship and how it's all a propaganda machine, essentially. And you go and you carry water for Barry Rice. I was really blown away by that. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to make excuses for him. I think maybe he, you know, feels some, you know, positive energy for her for doing what she did when she left the New York Times. But he's supposed to be a truth teller, and he ought to say that, no, at that time, man, she was way off base, and she was showing that the default position is attacking Tulsi, even if you don't know what you're talking about. That's what she was being fed, and it really is exactly the kind of thing she talked against. How there's this mindset at the New York Times in the newsroom that we're going to tell you what you need to, you know, what propaganda you need to feed the public. And but she couldn't break out of it at that time. It would have been interesting if when she broke out and wrote that letter, if she'd actually said, yeah, you know, and my bad take on Tulsi was a you know, a result of that, you know. But crazy stuff.
That's giving her too much benefit of the doubt, I think.
Yeah, I think so too. Yeah.
I mean, how can you have that much disdain for somebody that you don't even really know anything about, you know?
Exactly.
I mean, Glenn Greenwald, I mean, I think he's probably a difficult person to deal with on a one-to-one level. I would just imagine, you know, I don't live with him, you know, but I still respect him because I'm not going to cancel him because of one thing.
Oh, for sure. No, I didn't say that I would cancel him. I'm just saying that I was really taken aback when I heard this. I was like, wow.
Yeah, I'd like to watch the interview to get the full.
Yeah, that happened towards the end, just so you know.
Okay.